It's one of those stories that makes you stop and ask, what could drive someone to walk into a place everyone else runs away from? In May 2013, a 26-year-old Swedish student named John Philip Bronish set out on a trip through Central America. He wasn't an explorer chasing fame, and he wasn't a journalist looking for a scoop. He was just a smart, curious guy who liked to see the world for himself. He spoke several languages, Swedish, English, Chinese, and was learning a few more. And he had that quiet type of curiosity that pushes people a little further than most would go. Jan's plan was to cross one of the most dangerous regions on Earth, the Darian Gap, a dense, roadless stretch of jungle between Colombia and Panama. It's the one missing piece of the Pan-American Highway, the only break in an otherwise continuous road that stretches from Alaska all the way down to Argentina. That gap exists for a reason. Locals call it a no-man's land. It's not just wild nature, it's a war zone. Thick, swampy rainforests, rivers that flood overnight, poisonous snakes, mosquitoes carrying disease, and the constant threat of armed groups, guerrillas, paramilitaries, and drug traffickers, all operating in secrecy. Even most locals don't go near it. There are no roads, no real law enforcement, and no guarantee you'll make it out. But for Jan, that was exactly what made it fascinating. He had always been interested in language and culture, especially in the parts of the world that most people knew little about. Friends said he loved to travel alone because it forced him to meet people and learn how things really worked outside the safety net of cities and schedules. And when he decided to explore Central America, the Darian Gap became this final frontier, one of the last truly unconnected places left on the map. At the time, John was living in China, studying statistics and languages. His family said he was quiet but focused, the kind of person who plans everything carefully. So when he said he wanted to go through Panama and Colombia, it didn't sound reckless at first. He wasn't chasing adrenaline. He just wanted to understand the region. He arrived in Central America in early 2013. Over the next few months, he traveled slowly through different countries, taking buses, meeting locals, moving at his own pace. He kept a small backpack with basic gear, a GPS tracker, maps, and notebooks. He sent messages home now and then, updating his family about where he was and what he was doing. Nothing about this trip suggested it would end the way it did. By late May, Jan had made his way toward the border area between Panama and Colombia, near the lower Atrato River. That's one of the most remote and unstable regions of the Darien, a place even experienced guides try to avoid. What Jan probably didn't know was that this area had recently turned into an active conflict zone. Rival guerrilla factions, cartel groups, and the Colombian military were all clashing for control of drug routes that cut through that jungle. Locals described it as a silent war. Helicopters circled overhead, villages were abandoned, and gunfire at night was common. But from the outside, you wouldn't know that, especially as a traveler coming through small port towns where people are friendly and talkative, and where the jungle looks like any other dense tropical forest. At this point, Jan planned to move through the region by boat. It's one of the only ways to navigate the Atrato River area. He hired a local boat driver to take him along the river toward the Colombian side, where he likely hoped to continue his journey on foot. That stretch of river, though, was heavily monitored, not by the government but by the FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, one of the most powerful guerrilla groups in Latin America. The FARC had been fighting the Colombian state for decades. By 2013, they were fractured but still active in remote zones. They didn't trust outsiders, especially foreigners carrying electronics. To them, a person with a GPS, detailed maps, and a camera didn't look like a traveler. They looked like a spy. And on that day, Jan was heading straight into their territory. Sometime in late May 2013, Jan and the boat driver started their trip up the Atrato River. It was supposed to be routine, a few hours of travel through dense rainforest waterways. But somewhere along the way, they were stopped. According to the driver, the only witness, a group of armed men appeared along the riverbank and ordered them to stop. The men carried rifles and wore camouflage. They climbed into the boat, checked everyone on board, and started questioning them. When they saw John, a tall foreigner with European features, they immediately singled him out. The driver later said they barely spoke. The men told him to step aside, then ordered Jan to come with them. They led him off the boat and into the jungle. That was the last time anyone saw him alive. The driver, terrified, turned the boat around and went back downstream. He later told locals what happened, that the foreigner he was carrying had been taken by armed men. But in a region controlled by guerrillas, there wasn't much anyone could do. The jungle swallowed everything. Sounds, footprints, evidence. Days passed. Then weeks. Jan didn't return. His family back in Sweden waited for updates, but none came. They tried contacting him online, but his accounts went silent. Eventually, they reached out to Swedish authorities and the embassies in Colombia and Panama. A search was launched, though it was more of an information search than a physical one. You can't just walk into the Darian looking for someone, especially when it's under guerrilla control. Officials tried to talk to locals, but people in those river communities were afraid to speak. In that part of Colombia, information can get you killed. For months, John's case remained open, but with no progress. No ransom demands, no proof of life, no leads. The only thing investigators had was that one account, that he had been taken into the jungle by armed men. And then, silence. In the years that followed, people in the region began to whisper about what might have happened. Some said he was kidnapped for ransom. Others said he was mistaken for an undercover agent. And there were darker rumors that he had been executed because FARC fighters thought he was mapping their routes for the military. For a long time, no one could prove any of it. Months had passed, and Jan's disappearance was no longer just a missing person case. It was becoming one of those stories that haunted everyone who'd heard about it. His family kept searching for answers, but everything led to dead ends. The area he vanished in wasn't just dangerous. It was cut off from the rest of the world. You couldn't just send a search team in. Even the military moved there cautiously. The Colombian government had little control over those jungles, and anyone asking questions about a missing foreigner risked drawing the wrong kind of attention. Back in Sweden, his family refused to give up. They reached out to international agencies, journalists, and NGOs who'd worked in Colombia before. A few leads came in. Travelers who'd passed through nearby villages said locals remembered seeing a tall European man days before he vanished. Some said he was friendly, spoke a little Spanish, and didn't seem scared. But after that, nothing. Authorities began to suspect what everyone privately feared, that he had crossed paths with one of the guerrilla groups. The FARC had been active in that area for decades, and during 2013, internal conflict had made them even more paranoid. They were fighting rival groups for control of smuggling routes, and the Colombian military had ramped up airstrikes in the lower Atrato region. Villages were being bombed, truces were falling apart, and both sides were losing people fast. It was, in every sense, a war zone. And into that chaos had walked a young European with a GPS in his backpack. To the FARC, technology like that wasn't something a tourist carried. In their eyes, only soldiers, journalists, or spies used tracking devices. That misunderstanding, combined with the paranoia of war, can turn deadly very fast. Months turned into a year, then more. His name would occasionally surface in Swedish and Colombian news outlets, but there was never any confirmation of what happened. His family kept asking both governments for updates, but there were none. The jungle had swallowed him. Then, 2 years later in 2015, something changed. Colombia was in the middle of peace negotiations with the FARC. For the first time in decades, the guerrilla leadership was sitting down with the government to discuss disarmament. During those talks, one of the key conditions was accountability. FARC had to provide information on people who had been kidnapped or killed in their territories. And that's when Jan's name came up. Representatives from FARC admitted that a foreign man matching Jan's description had been captured by one of their local units in the Darian region in 2013. At first, they said they thought he was a spy, a foreign operative working with the Colombian military. When they found his GPS device and detailed maps, they were convinced. He was interrogated, beaten, and eventually executed. The admission was brief and matter-of-fact, but it finally confirmed what everyone had suspected. FARC didn't deny it. In their statement, they said it had been a mistake made during wartime. They also provided information about where he had been buried. Colombian authorities, with help from forensic teams and humanitarian workers, went into the region under supervision to locate the remains. It wasn't easy. The terrain was brutal, and even with coordinates, it took several attempts to reach the site. When they finally did, they found human remains in a shallow grave near the river, along with fragments of clothing, a few personal items, and parts of a GPS unit. DNA testing later confirmed what no one wanted to hear. It was Jan. After 2 years of silence, the truth was out, though it offered little comfort. His body was flown back to Sweden, and the story made international news for a short while. A young man with an adventurous spirit had been mistaken for a spy and executed in one of the world's most lawless jungles. But even then, there were unanswered questions. Some reports suggested that the fighters who captured him weren't senior FARC members, but a smaller splinter group working under the flag. Others said that he had been held for a few days before they decided to kill him, unsure what to do with him. There were no clear details on whether anyone was ever punished for it. The local commander who ordered it had likely died in the fighting long before the peace talks even began. What stood out, though, was how ordinary his motivations were. He wasn't seeking danger. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He just wanted to see the world, to understand a region most people never set foot in. That curiosity, the same trait that made him interesting and open-minded, was what ultimately led him to that river. In the years since, his story has become one of the best-known modern tragedies of the Darian Gap. For travelers, it's a grim reminder that there are still places on Earth where maps and courage aren't enough, where the wrong step, or even the wrong device in your bag, can decide your fate. Even today, the Darian Gap hasn't changed much. The wars have shifted, but the danger remains. Migrants from South America, Africa, and the Middle East cross it every year, trying to reach North America. Many don't make it. The same rivers and jungles that swallowed John still hide countless others. It's one of the few places left where you can disappear completely. Not metaphorically, but literally. The jungle erases you. And for Jan Philip Bronish, that's exactly what happened. He walked into a place where maps ended, trying to find a path that didn't exist, and became part of the dark history that keeps the Darian Gap feared to this day. Even though Jan's story ended with confirmation of what happened, the Darian Gap itself didn't stop taking lives. If anything, it only got worse. By the time investigators found Jan's remains in 2015, the jungle that killed him had already become one of the busiest migration corridors in the world. Thousands of people were trying to cross it, not for adventure, but for survival. Families from South America, the Caribbean, and Africa were walking through the same stretch of jungle that had once been considered impossible to survive. Most didn't even know who controlled the territory they were in. Some were robbed, others kidnapped, and many simply vanished without a trace. Bodies washed up in rivers, and yet the flow of people never stopped. To this day, the Darian is a graveyard disguised as a jungle. For people who remember Jan's case, that's what makes his story stand out. It wasn't just about a single mistake or one unlucky encounter. It showed how fragile the line is between curiosity and danger when you step into a place that doesn't follow any normal rules. If you look back at the reports and the timeline of his last days, there's something eerily simple about it all. He didn't go missing in some dramatic fashion. He didn't vanish on camera or leave behind a cryptic message. He was just a young man sitting on a boat watching the river go by, and a few minutes later he was gone. That's all it takes in a place like that. People who live along the Atrato River know that silence better than anyone. When someone disappears out there, you don't go asking questions. You don't chase after the story. The jungle answers to no one, and the people who control it, whether it's guerrillas or traffickers, decide what gets known and what stays buried. That's part of why it took so long for the truth about Jan's death to come out. Even when FARC admitted to it, it wasn't because of a confession out of guilt. It was a technical acknowledgement, a box to check during a peace negotiation. The line was buried in a list of hundreds of similar cases: kidnappings, killings, disappearances. For them, it was one mistake among many in a decades-long war. For his family, it was everything. After his remains were returned to Sweden, local media there followed the story closely. People were struck by how calm and intelligent Jan was described to be, not the kind of person who took reckless risks. His teachers talked about his discipline. His friends remembered how he used to plan every detail of his trips. It made people wonder, how could someone so careful end up in such a dangerous situation? The truth is, the Darian doesn't play by the same logic. It's not like climbing a mountain or crossing a desert where preparation equals safety. In the Darian, even perfect planning can't protect you from the human factor, from fear, suspicion, and control. There's also another detail that rarely gets talked about: the timing. In 2013, when Jan entered the region, the Colombian military had just launched a major campaign against the FARC's remaining factions in the west. Bombings and raids were constant, and the rebels were on edge. Paranoia ran high. Anyone who didn't belong there, especially a foreigner, would have been seen as a potential enemy. It's likely that Jan never even had a chance to explain who he was. Once the men boarded that boat and saw his gear, they had already decided. The jungle wasn't a place for conversations. After FARC's admission, there were attempts to document what happened. A few reports, some interviews, even humanitarian papers that mentioned him by name. But those reports never made it into mainstream awareness for long. The world moves fast, and stories like Jan's tend to get buried under newer headlines. Still, among travelers, journalists, and people who research high-risk zones, his case became one of those quiet warnings, the kind of story people reference when someone says they want to cross the Darian just to see what it's like. And what makes it stick isn't just how it ended. It's how ordinary it began. Before that day on the river, Jan had been doing what countless travelers do: meeting locals, learning about new places, collecting experiences. Nothing about him screamed danger. He wasn't doing anything illegal. He wasn't trespassing on military ground. He was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And in the Darian, that's all it takes. Today, parts of that region are a little more accessible than they used to be, but not by much. The Colombian side still sees activity from armed groups, even after FARC's peace agreement. Other factions took over the routes they once controlled. The jungle looks the same: thick, humid, and endless. But what's hidden beneath it changes constantly. Every year, new names are added to the list of people who vanish there. Migrants, researchers, and occasionally travelers who think they can handle it. Most never reappear. The few who do come out often describe it as the hardest thing they've ever done, not because of the terrain, but because of the fear that hangs over every step. When you talk to locals in towns near the border, they'll tell you the same thing. The Darian isn't just a jungle. It's a place that watches you. People who go in without permission don't come back, and when someone does, they don't talk much about what they saw. In that sense, Jan's story is almost predictable, and that's what makes it unsettling. He didn't defy warnings. He didn't go chasing some lost civilization or trying to make a name for himself. He just believed he could understand a place by walking through it. But in the Darian, understanding isn't part of the deal. Even though it's been more than a decade since his death, there's still no full record of what exactly happened in those final hours. Whether he tried to explain who he was, whether they listened, whether he realized what was happening, none of that is known. The FARC's admission was clinical, without emotion. It didn't tell the story, it just confirmed the ending. And that's the kind of silence the Darian leaves behind. Somewhere along that river, in the thick of the jungle where the trees grow so close that sunlight barely touches the ground, a small group of men made a choice that ended one person's life and left a family searching for answers for years. That's how fast things disappear out there. A boat stops, a man is led into the trees, and that's it. Over the years, the Darian Gap has developed a reputation that feels almost unreal. People call it the missing link of the Americas. But that phrase doesn't really describe what it is. It's not just a missing road. It's an entire world cut off from everything around it. There are parts of that jungle that even satellite imagery struggles to map clearly. It changes constantly. Rivers flood and carve new routes. Old paths disappear overnight. If you talk to anyone who's crossed it, they'll tell you that it's not a journey you plan. It's something you survive. Even now, when you read reports about migrants crossing through, the numbers don't always add up. Thousands go in, fewer come out, and nobody keeps track of what happens in between. There are no checkpoints, no reliable maps, no consistent routes. The only constant is danger, not just from nature, but from the people who control the land. And the lower Atrato region, the same area where John disappeared, is still one of the most unpredictable zones. The FARC may have signed a peace agreement, but splinter groups took over the drug corridors they left behind. These new groups don't answer to anyone. They fight each other for territory, sometimes changing alliances every few months. Locals say that when one group takes over a region, they paint new symbols on trees or buildings, warnings to everyone who knows how to read them. For outsiders, those warnings mean nothing. You could walk right past one and never realize you've entered a zone controlled by people who don't want you there. That's what makes the Darien so deceptive. It doesn't look like a battlefield. It looks like nature at its purest. Green, humid, beautiful. You can hear birds, running water, the sound of wind moving through the leaves, but beneath that is an invisible line of control, and crossing it without permission can end the same way it did for Jan. Every now and then, his name resurfaces in travel forums and online discussions, usually when someone brings up the idea of hiking or exploring the Darien. People will say, "Remember the Swedish guy who disappeared?" And it always circles back to the same question. Why would anyone go there? That question doesn't have a simple answer. Curiosity, adventure, idealism, all of it probably played a part. For Jan, it wasn't about showing off or chasing risk. It was about experiencing something unfiltered, something real. In a world where almost everything is mapped, fenced, or commercialized, he wanted to see a place that still existed outside all of that. But that's the trap of the Darien. It tempts people with the idea of untouched wilderness when in reality, it's not untouched. It's heavily occupied, just not in a way most people can see. In some ways, Jan's story is a perfect example of how perception can get someone killed. To him, a GPS was just a tool to navigate. To the people who found him, it was proof of surveillance. His language skills, his maps, his appearance, all of it combined into a profile that made no sense in that environment. They saw patterns where there were none. And once that suspicion takes hold in a place like the Darien, there's no coming back from it. People who work in conflict zones talk about something called the fog of the jungle. It's not literal fog. It's the confusion, the lack of communication, the layers of fear that make rational decisions almost impossible. A single misunderstanding can turn fatal because everyone assumes the worst. In 2013, when Jan walked into that world, the fog was thicker than ever. Even after his death, investigators and journalists tried to piece together his route. They used his old emails, social media posts, and bank records to map his path through Central America. The goal was to understand if there had been a point where someone could have stopped him or warned him. But it turned out that his movements looked normal up until the day he vanished. There were no warning signs, no desperate messages, just a traveler moving forward. His case sits in that strange space between cautionary tale and mystery. You can look at it as a story of bad timing, or as something that reflects how unpredictable the world still is in places most people will never see. The Darian Gap has seen journalists disappear, missionaries vanish, and soldiers go missing in action, and most of those stories never make it out. John's case only did because he was from Europe, and because his family refused to let it fade away. When you think about the logistics of what it took to recover his remains, it says a lot about the place itself. It took 2 years, multiple government agencies, pressure from a foreign nation, and a peace negotiation for anyone to even enter that jungle to find him. And that was just one person. Imagine how many more are still out there, without names, buried under the same soil. There's no real map of the Darian Gap, not in a practical sense. Every time someone tries to chart it, the terrain changes before they finish. That instability has kept it lawless for decades, and it's part of why it's such a powerful symbol. It's a physical gap, but it's also a kind of moral one, a space where rules break down, and where everything depends on who you meet. For people who live nearby, the jungle isn't mysterious. It's just dangerous. It's a place to stay away from unless you absolutely have to go in. For outsiders, though, it still carries this strange allure, the last blank space on the map, the ultimate test of survival. That's what keeps stories like Jan's alive. They remind people that even in the age of GPS, satellites, and instant information, there are still places where the map doesn't save you, where being careful, smart, or prepared still might not be enough. The jungle doesn't care who you are or what you came to see. And if you cross into the wrong territory, the only thing that matters is what they think you are. That's how one wrong assumption, made in the middle of a river, turned into the end of a journey that was supposed to be about curiosity and connection. And as long as people keep trying to cross the Darien, the same silence that followed Jan's last steps is going to keep repeating, over and over, through the thick, humid air of a jungle that never gives anything back.